Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather, and today I am here to talk to you about everything that I read for Jane Austen July, which actually was quite a bit more than I thought it was going to be. So let's talk about it. I would also like to point out my new favorite purchase, a Janeite t-shirt to go with the sweatshirt that I already have. These are from Inkwell Threads, and they are so comfortable and just delightful. Firstly, let's talk about the two group reads. So of course I reread Pride and Prejudice, and it was an absolute delight, as always. And I realized I've been showing the wrong illustration for my favorite Mr. Collins illustration. Oh No, I Never Read Novels is quite good. However, this one, when relating the whole affair of Lydia's to Lady Catherine, look at that face. That is the most ridiculous face I've ever seen. And I love it. And then of course I also reread Lady Susan for the novella or short work group read, which is indeed not illustrated as I thought, and it was also lovely. I hadn't reread this one as recently, so it was quite fun going back and rereading it, especially having seen Love and Friendship in the meantime, and so now being able to keep better track of who was who and who was related, who was writing to whom. Next, I have the two works that I read by a contemporary of Jane Austen or by an author that Austen might have read herself. So my first read was The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, which was good. It was much easier to read than Udolpho, for which I was very happy. It is also much shorter than Udolpho, for which I am also grateful. It's interesting. I did find it almost Northanger Abbey-esque in terms of the reality of the mysteries are much more mundane and human than we are first led to believe. That being said, it is still quite over the top. It's a slog to get through. I did fall asleep at several points trying to read it, but it's interesting, and I'm glad that I have finally read it. I feel like it lends more background to Northanger Abbey, but also to Emma, as this is the book that Harriet Smith recommends that Mr. Martin read quite early on. He doesn't, or at least he hasn't yet, but now I have, and I know the sorts of things that Harriet might have been imagining. In addition, I read The Beau's Stratagem by George Farquhar. This is an early 18th century play, but it may have still been in performance, or Austen might have read it perhaps as a family theatrical. And it is the story of two young men, Amewell and Archer, who have fallen on quite hard times, such that they are moving from town to town, living in inns, and they are taking it in turn to pretend who is the master and who is the servant. So it's never entirely clear what the actual case is, or are they both gentlemen and just using this as some kind of disguise. But at this inn, they run into a variety of characters, including two young women that they would like to pursue, along with the Sullens, who are an unhappily married couple, and Lady Bountiful, who is often referenced in Austenian works, who is sort of a mother-in-law figure who thinks she has a cure for everything. And it's doubtful whether or not she actually does, but she thinks she does. And it was very intriguing. I'm glad I read it. The prose is certainly very good. The dialogue is very good. I didn't find it quite as funny as I hoped I would, and I feel like that's just a factor of not having seen it performed. I think there's a lot of opportunity for physical comedy, for who's in the room, who's not in the room, who's about to enter the room. the way these lines are delivered could inject some humor. Yeah, it's a play. It's better seen than read, but reading it was the only option I had, and I'm glad I did. Next, for my nonfiction, I read a couple of different books. The first two are cookbooks. We have Tea with Jane Austen by Kim Wilson and Jane Austen's Table by Robert Tousley Anderson. These are both very different cookbooks, and I read them in my search for a Regency recipe to make, and you will have seen how that turned out by now. But this one is more a look at things that could have been served at various meals, but Anderson tends to put a modern sort of twist on them. So it was fun, and I'm glad I have it, but I didn't find a lot that I could easily adapt. Regency cooking is not made for those who have multiple allergies. Tea with Jane Austen is slightly different in terms of there were fewer recipes for me to work with. The rest of it is more a look at tea within Jane Austen's lifetime, the importance of tea, where it came from, how it made it to Britain, how it was stored, how it was served, all of those rituals around tea. So it was quite an interesting read, but not quite the cookbook that I thought it was going to be. I also read The Covent Garden Ladies by Hallie Rubenhold, and this one I listened to on audiobook. I love Hallie Rubenhold, and I think she still did her typical thorough job in terms of research and detail and keeping the story as focused as she could. If you're unaware, Covent Garden was not only the major theater district, as it still is, but in addition to that, in the Georgian era, it was also a hub of prostitutes, because when people left the theater, they were seeking more entertainment for the evening, so prostitutes had prime pickings of audience members and tavern goers in the area. And in, I believe, the mid-1700s, there was a list published called Mr. Harris's List, which listed all of the prostitutes in Covent Garden, certainly the most respectable ones, including their names, their addresses, what they looked like, and their specialties, so to speak. And so Hallie Rubenhold details who Mr. Harris was, who the primary writers and publishers were, and how they got to that point, what 18th century prostitution was like, and then in the middle we get the list itself. I think that took up about 2 chapters of the audiobook. It was very long and very detailed. And then we get the aftermath of what effect the publishing of this list had on these sex workers and on the men who wrote it and published it. And it was very interesting. The only problem is, I think I would have enjoyed it more if it hadn't been an audiobook, because the copy my library had was read by, let me get her name right, was read by Lucy Rayner, who is not the listed reader on the library copy or on Goodreads, so there might be 2 different readers out there. But I did not care for Lucy Rayner's style of narration, because it seemed to me that she was trying to sound very sexy and very seductive all the time, and that's not always appropriate with this book. So it just got to be a bit much after a while. But I think if I had read it as a physical book, I might have enjoyed it that little bit more. But it was still very interesting and very well researched, and I still enjoy Hallie Rubenhold very much as an author. As a follow-up to that, I then read Harriet Wilson's memoirs, which are by Harriet Wilson, and this edition was edited by Leslie Branch. And Harriet Wilson was, by all accounts, the greatest courtesan of her age. So she was a step up from your basic prostitute. She tended to go for kind of live-in mistress kind of positions with the aristocracy. Harriet Wilson was mistress to some of the greatest figures of the Regency era, including the Duke of Wellington. She wrote to Lord Byron for quite a while, and they had quite a friendship. I don't believe they ever had any romantic relationship. And yet I had never heard of her until last year, which was the first time I saw Being Mr. Wickham. So I tracked down these memoirs so I could read what she had to say for herself. And these were written at a point when she was getting older, so being a courtesan was no longer entirely financially viable. So she wrote these memoirs as a source of income, but then also offered all of her former lovers the opportunity to be edited out of them for the price of £200. Some of them took her up on it, but some of them didn't. And I found the introduction a bit of a slog. I really did not enjoy Leslie Branch's style of writing. I had a few quibbles with some things that she said towards the end of it, but I really enjoyed the memoirs. I found Harriet Wilson's style very readable. How true everything is a guessing game because, of course, it's a memoir. This is her perception of things. And at this point, who are we to say that they didn't happen that way? But it was quite fun. I don't know that I would have wanted to meet her in person, but she was quite a fun character to follow. So I really enjoyed reading these, and I would recommend tracking them down yourself if you are interested. Then, just for fun, I also went through Pride and Prejudice and Puzzles, which is by Richard Galland. And this is exactly what it sounds like. These are a bunch of fun puzzles themed around each of Austen's 6 main novels. So they are sometimes logic puzzles, sometimes Sudoku type puzzles, spot the difference puzzles with illustrations, all sorts of different ones. I tended to stick with the word searches, although I did not draw in the book itself because I would like to reuse these over and over again. So I just have photos of those on my iPad, and then I was able to highlight where I found the particular phrases. So I wouldn't call it reading that book, but I did have fun working with it throughout the month. Then in terms of fiction that is either a retelling of an Austen work or set within the Regency era, I read a bunch of different things. Firstly, I had 2 ebook arcs that were set within the Regency era, so I decided to read those first and do my reviews. The first one was Something in the Air by Suzanne Enoch. I truly hated this one. The premise is that the heroine and hero are in a marriage of convenience in order for her to keep her family estate. But her grandfather soon exacts another condition, that she must be married with children. And now, several years later, because it is his birthday, he wants to get the entire family together. And our heroine has to reveal to her husband that not only has she married him for convenience, but in her letters she has made up 2 children. And now they are going to have to produce these 2 children. And thus begins the ins and outs of them recruiting 2 children to play the roles of their actual children, and all of the problems that then ensue. There are problems aplenty in that setup, but it was so much worse once we actually read it. There is very little character development. They claim that there is a deepening of the romance between our 2 main characters, but you really don't get to see any of that. You just feel terrible for these poor children that they end up picking up. It was utterly predictable in a lot of places. Plus there was the line very early on as the heroine is thinking about how their relationship has fallen apart since their marriage. And she used the phrase something along the lines of how when on their wedding night, when he had initiated the physical side of things, that she was not ready for, that was when everything began to fall apart. And there is so much wrong with that line alone. So I would highly encourage you not to read this one when it comes out. There are many far better Regency romances available. I then read A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting by Sophie Irwin, which was certainly better than my other ebook. Still only a middling sort of read for me. In this one, our heroine is the oldest of, I think, 5 sisters, and they are recently orphaned. Their parents are slightly lower class, and they have no money left. And so our oldest heroine goes to visit her mother's best friend in London with her middle sister, and is determined to capture a very wealthy husband. And I will say this was not entirely predictable. There were a few good twists and turns that kept me interested. It was certainly not nearly as problematic as the other ebook, but I still felt like there were a few issues that weren't quite cleared up or didn't entirely make me feel comfortable with the ending. It was okay. It had a fairly decent view of Regency high society, but just nothing terribly memorable. Then I listened to The Particular Charm of Miss Jane Austen by Ada Bright and Cass Grafton. That is surprisingly difficult to say. This is a story about Rose, who lives and works in modern-day Bath, and she and her friend Morgan, who is American, are getting together for the annual Jane Austen Festival in September. And this is the first time that they're meeting in person, and she is so excited. But as they're going to various events, she begins to suspect that the real Jane Austen is wandering around Bath and potentially inhabiting the upstairs apartment. And thus begins a roller coaster of events. There is a major plot twist that quite changes the direction that this book takes, but I don't feel like I can tell you about it just yet. I found this absolutely beautiful. Is it Pulitzer Prize winning literature? No, but it has no pretensions to be. But everything that it says about the power of Jane Austen's work and the power of friendships formed through a love of Austen on the internet is something that I could deeply connect to, and it just made the story that much more powerful and wonderful for me. So if you are also a booktuber who loves Jane Austen and has had similar experiences, definitely pick this one up. I feel like you would get a lot out of it. In fact, I loved it so much that I then read the sequel, The Unexpected Past of Miss Jane Austen. So slight spoilers here if you haven't read book 1, but book 2 picks up when Rose and a friend are standing outside her apartment, and Miss Jane Austen reappears and brings them back to the 1800s. I believe it's 1813 or 1814, for a particular mission that she refuses to disclose, but she needs Rose. This one was still very good, and I did enjoy it. I didn't love it as much as the first one because it didn't have those same themes that had made me love the first one so much, but it was still really well done, and I really enjoyed it. I then read Pandora by Susan Stokes-Chapman, which takes place in 1799. And it's the story of a young woman named Pandora whose parents owned an antique store, but they died during an excavation, and now her uncle runs it, who is not fond of her at all. But slowly this Grecian urn, this pithos, I believe it's called, comes into their lives and starts to change everything. It feels very much like Pandora's box. This is very strange but very powerful, Because of how dark it is, I hesitate to say that I enjoyed it, but it was very well written. I did not see a lot of the twists coming. It was very magically real. I don't know if it was intended to be, but it felt like magical realism to me. The only quibble I really have with it is how a particular character is painted. And I can't really tell you why, because I feel like it would be a spoiler if I did. But this particular character is gay, and he never acts on it, but I feel like he is portrayed as slightly predatory. And I'm not sure if that's just Pandora's perception of him, or if that's how stoke-chapman meant to portray him. But either way, that made me feel slightly uncomfortable. But the rest of it is very, very good, and I would highly recommend it. And then finally, I bought and read Godmother Park by Jill Hornby. I finished this an hour ago, and I very much enjoyed it. This is the story of Anne Sharp, who became a friend of Jane Austen, but who was first the governess of Fanny Knight at Godmersham Park in Kent, which was Jane's brother Henry's estate, or one of his estates. This was very, very good. I knew nothing about Anne Sharp. Indeed, very few people do, such that Jill Hornby did have to make up a past for her, because we have so little information as to how she became a governess and how she ended up at Godmersham. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about Henry, but I feel like that's how you're meant to feel. My dislike for the Knights is growing the more I read about them, and I'm not sure that's entirely fair. I feel like I have to do more research to find out, but then I don't necessarily want to do that research because I dislike them. Someone help me out of this circle. But the writing was still beautiful. The emotion behind it is really powerful. I would definitely recommend this if you're thinking about it. I didn't find it as powerful as Miss Austen, but still very, very good. And then in terms of the watching challenges, let's see. For the direct adaptations, I rewatched the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. My mother and I burned through that in about 2 days. It is always a delight. I love all of the details that they were able to include in it. And we rewatched Love and Friendship, which is also a delight, a very faithful adaptation. Plus, I loved their music choices, especially the inclusion of Suave sia il vento at the end from Così fan tutte, which I need to do an opera video on for my series, so that may prompt me to do that sooner rather than later. I also watched the new Persuasion, if we can call that a direct adaptation. It's pretending to be a direct adaptation, but those of us who watched it know that it definitely is not. They got it all wrong. From the main characters, to the dialogue, to the way the plot rolls out. It was terrible. 0 out of 10, do not recommend. Save yourself if you haven't watched it yet. Then in terms of adaptations or other Regency films, I watched a couple. Firstly, as you will see in the vlog, Marissa and I went to see Mr. Malcolm's List as it was playing nearby, and it was very cute. I liked it very much. It didn't have quite the humor that the original short film did, which you can see on YouTube, but I am glad that they were able to keep most of the original cast from that short film, and hopefully they go on to do other wonderful things as well. There were some slight historical inaccuracies, but other than that, it was a really fun time, and I'm really glad that we saw it. I also rewatched the one-man show Being Mr. Wickham with Megan Hannett of Megan the Story Girl, and that was a lot of fun. I get something new out of that every single time I watch it, because you can't trust anything that Mr. Wickham says, so it makes it such fun to analyze. If you didn't get a chance to see it, it was a one-man show that Adrian Lucas put together. It was written by someone else, but I think he had a big hand in creating it. and he was the original Mr. Wickham from 1995. And as Adrian Lucas turned 60, he began to wonder, well, what would Mr. Wickham be like as 60? And so you join Mr. Wickham as he is newly turned 60, and he regales you with tales of his past and indeed his present. You get to hear how his relationship with Lydia is working and not working, tales from his childhood, and indeed tales from within the book. How he sees Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth now, how everyone's children are getting on. There is so much to it, and much as we hate Mr. Wickham, I love watching that show. I also watched another film last night to wrap up my Jane Austen July, and that was Miss Austen Regrets. I finally got around to rewatching it. I had watched this when it first aired. In the States, it aired on PBS in, I want to say, 2007. So I was around about 15 or 16 at the time. So I enjoyed it, but it left me feeling very unsettled. It's the story of Jane Austen in the final few years of her life, both helping her niece Fanny with her love life and also looking back on her own and any potential regrets that she has about her life. And I feel like I appreciate it much more now that I am almost double that age, because the entire world looks different now than it did when I was still in high school. And so I can appreciate the bittersweetness and the anger and the sadness that comes out, but also the joy and just throwing caution to the wind occasionally and everything in between. I felt like it was really, really well done. It was very real about the grosser sides of the Regency, but not in a way that felt gratuitous like other Regency films I've seen. And so yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that I rewatched it now. And I feel like I'm forgetting something, but I can't remember it. If I have forgotten something, I will put the title of it down below. And if not, I will simply wrap up and say that is everything that I read and watched for Jane Austen July. Let me know how your Jane Austen Julys went, if you read or watched something that you think I might enjoy, and if you have any questions about any of the things that I mentioned in this video. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.